All right, welcome back. We were looking at Germanic kingdoms emerging. We had talked about Clovis using Christianity to unite his warriors, bringing Christianity to the Frankish people. We had talked about Charles the Hammer Martel, winning the Battle of Tours and allowing Christianity to continue to grow and spread in Europe instead of Islam. Those are two of the big three that we're going to look at. Names that start with C. Of course, Charlemagne, who you see here, is going to be the last man on the list. So let's go ahead and progress on into Charlemagne's story. Charlemagne's one of those guys who really was kind of larger than life. Part of the reason is because he was very tall. But Charlemagne really was successful in just about everything he did. He rarely ever lost a battle. Some say he never lost a battle. He was loved by his people. He spread Christianity. Doesn't mean he wasn't a bad guy. There are some stories that show that he killed people if they did not convert to Christianity, but in the end, he's pretty much the most remarkable figure of the Middle Ages, at least in terms of leadership. So let's take a look at Charlemagne and his story here. So Charlemagne becomes emperor. Well, Pepin the Short died in 768. Of course, when you have a member of a family that dies who has power, you got to look to who's going to take over next. And Charles the Great, better known as Charlemagne, takes over in 771. Now, the reason it takes 3 years for him to take over is Charlemagne and his brother actually kind of bickered over who would rule the kingdom. And Charlemagne's brother ends up dead. We don't know if Charlemagne had anything to do with it. He may not have, although certainly it looks like he might have had his brother killed so he can take power. But that's not historical fact. That's more historical myth or legend. But regardless, Charlemagne takes power in 771. Charlemagne himself was a very imposing figure, standing 6'4", which would have been very tall at the time. People would have seen this; they would have recognized that he was a tall man, and that would have helped kind of build up his reputation because people like to talk about that. That would have been something people would have remembered. So let's talk about Charlemagne as king. There's a lot of really good things that Charlemagne does here. Charlemagne was now the most powerful king in Western Europe. One of the things Charlemagne's able to do is he built up the greatest empire known since the Romans. Nobody had had an empire like his. Now, it's not as big as the Romans, it's not as powerful as the Romans, but listen to what I'm saying here. Realistically, since the Romans, nobody had anything like this. There's a lot of different power changing hands, different tribes fighting one another. So Charlemagne really stands out here. Charlemagne definitely was a Christian. His conquests against the Muslims to the south and the east to spread Christianity. He saw the Muslims as a threat, and he went there and fought them successfully and prevented Islam from spreading further into Europe. And because of this, he really, in his territory, he really united Western Europe for the first time since the Roman Empire. So, because he had more land than anybody else, he really had kind of a stable empire. And that's significant because that hadn't happened since the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. So, we're talking a good 300-year period since there was this kind of peace and stability in Europe. And the empire that he ruled later became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Obviously, the people knew their history. Whether they were educated or not, they knew of the Romans, and so anything attached to Rome was considered to be a good thing. So naming your empire after Rome would have been fairly significant. And because it was Christian, it got the name Holy Roman Empire. Now, one of the things that Charlemagne was really good at was strengthening his own power. And the way you do that is you go to the landowners within your kingdom and you say, you don't have power anymore. Because a lot of times in these Germanic areas, if you had land, you had power. And I think that's even still true today. But basically, what Charlemagne said is, you know what? I'm the leader. Not you guys. Not you out there who own the land. It's me. So Charlemagne strengthened his own power by weakening the power of the nobles. And that's smart if you use your power in a good way. As we're going to see, Charlemagne really is a pretty strong leader. He sent out royal agents to check on these powerful landowners. Basically said, I'm going to send out my guys, my men who are there to make sure my laws are being followed, and make sure these landowners out there aren't taking too much power for themselves, that they're not hurting their people and things like that. So this would have definitely been a strategic move to help ensure that people followed his laws. And I think that's pretty smart. One of the things that was very, very unusual for Charlemagne is he regularly visited his kingdom. He didn't coop himself up in the castle and just rule out of his throne. He went around and he visited the people. I mean, imagine that. You're a poor peasant living in somewhere in France, and all of a sudden you hear Charlemagne's in town, your king is in town, and you can see him, you can talk to him. I mean, that really is a big deal for the people. On top of that, for Charlemagne, of course, he had a better understanding of what was going on in his kingdom. So regularly visiting his kingdom was really a big deal. Charlemagne encouraged learning. He surrounded himself with scholars and opened new monasteries. There was a lot of kings in this time period who couldn't read or write, and Charlemagne decided he didn't want to be one of those. So he definitely encouraged learning. Of course, monasteries are religious communities run by the church where people could go, men could go and learn to read and write, among other things. Actually, you went there to serve God, but you would learn to read and write there at monasteries, so you could get an education. We're going to talk about monasteries a little bit more later on. Now, one of the most important stories that comes out of Charlemagne is in 800, the Pope had actually written Charlemagne a letter. There was some tribes that were kind of making life difficult for the Pope. They had actually threatened the Pope's life, and the Pope said, well, you know, if I need some help, I got to turn to the most powerful man in Europe. So he wrote a letter to Charlemagne saying, can you come to Rome and help me? So Charlemagne traveled to Rome to protect to protect the Pope, and these thugs that were badgering the Pope ran away. He got rid of them. So the Pope was thrilled. So the Pope decides, I'm going to reward Charlemagne. So what ends up happening is Charlemagne's called to this cathedral on Christmas Day, 800 AD. Charlemagne opens the door to this cathedral and everybody's there. He can see everybody. He walks in, and historians debate whether he really knew what was going on or not. Some say he knew exactly what was going to happen. Others say he was confused. He walked up to the front of the cathedral. The Pope basically says, Charlemagne, kneel. And the Pope crowned Charlemagne emperor. Now, he had been king of the Franks. He did not have that title of emperor yet. And this is interesting because think about it. If the Pope can crown you emperor, the Pope can also take that power away. So what this shows is that the church ended up having more power than the king. This historic coronation showed that the Pope had more power than the king. And some people say Charlemagne was uneasy about that. Others say he was really happy to have this title. There's lots of different ideas about this in history. But regardless, the Pope crowns him emperor. And this is really going to start drawing a line in the sand because it's going to try to really blur the lines between who has power. Is Charlemagne the most powerful man in Europe? Is the Pope the most powerful man in Europe? And there'll be hundreds of years where popes and kings debate this and actually fight each other over who has more power. And in this case, there's no doubt that it shows that the Pope had more power. Well, Charlemagne dies a short 14 years later. So Charlemagne died in 814, and his grandsons split up the kingdom. This is always a bad idea. You want to try to keep your land intact. Because if you split up the kingdom, eventually one of the grandsons, and this has happened in several cases in history, basically say, I want to try to reunite all the land. And then they fight their own family to try to reunite that land, and it leads to civil war and things like that, and that's just problematic. So definitely want to try to keep your land together as much as possible. One of the results of this is the Carolingian kings lost power and their authority broke down. So shortly after Charlemagne's death, his empire started to weaken. And that had everything to do with the fact that the land had been broken up. And this is going to lead to the rise of feudalism. When we come back in our next lesson, we're going to talk about what feudalism is. Feudalism is this system right here. Basically, it's the relationship between peasants, knights, nobles, and the king, and what each has to give in order to get some land or protection in return. So we're going to look at feudalism the next time around. And feudalism is definitely a byproduct of a weakened power from the top. a weakened king. If you have Charlemagne, you don't have the feudal system. But if you have grandsons that break up the kingdom, yeah, you might lead to the feudal system. So this will make more sense when we study this in our next lesson. So that brings us to our result. Through Christianity, Clovis was able to unite the Franks into a strong Christian military power. Then along comes Charles Martel. Charles Martel solidified Christianity's strength in Europe, which helped lead to the eventual rise of the more powerful Frankish king, Charlemagne. Charlemagne visited his people, he spread Christianity, he built monasteries, he never lost a battle, he had the biggest empire since the Romans. Charlemagne really was a larger-than-life king. All right, let's wrap this up with a second look at our constructive response question. The question says, distinguish the differences between Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, as well as some of their accomplishments. Well, we know that they're all leaders of the Franks, but we want to focus on their differences here. So Clovis, his story really is about how he uses Christianity to unite the Frankish people. After battle, he has his warriors baptized, and when you think about those warriors are likely going to go home, they're going to have their wives converted to Christianity, and ultimately what you're going to do is bring people together all under this one faith. And it was really mandatory that you followed that. So if you've got a lot of people who are now becoming Christian, they're making their wives Christian, their children Christian, obviously you all have that in common. And that's only going to make Christianity grow in the Frankish kingdom, which of course will become modern-day France someday. So that's Clovis's story. Charles Martel, he becomes a Christian hero by defeating the Moors at the Battle of Tours. Now, the Moors were a Muslim invading group. A lot of people suggest that if Charles Martel had not won this battle, Islam may have been able to establish itself more in Europe. There's not a lot of Islam in Europe today, and a lot of people attribute that to Charles Martel. So that's his story. But we focus very heavily on Charlemagne. I mean, Charlemagne was one of the best leaders of the Middle Ages. He regularly visited his kingdom. He built monasteries. He encouraged learning. Some people say he never lost a battle. There's all sorts of great things we can say about Charlemagne, and those are just some of the highlights from our notes that we have here. So ultimately, you want to be able to talk about these three individuals in this question to establish who each one of them were. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.